Just a warning. This episode contains topics that may not be suitable for all audiences. Listener discretion is advised. Hey everybody, I'm Zoe.
And I'm Chandi.
And this is Bound by the Cloak. Dr. Roy Hunt and his wife Mae were brutally murdered in their home in the middle of the night on the 26th of October in 1943. Roy Hunt was 36 years old, and Mae was only 26. They left behind two small children who were forever affected by the murder of their loving parents.
Imagine a small town in Texas, forever marred by a brutal crime that remains unsolved. In her book, Bound in Silence, An Unsolved Mystery in a Small Texas Town, author and Texan Christena Stephens pieces together a narrative that goes beyond the headlines, offering insight into the lives affected and the community that was forever changed. What sets this narrative apart is Christena's unique access to first-hand accounts from Joanne Hunt, the oldest child of the Hunts, who witnessed the brutal murder as a 5-year-old and whose life was forever shaped by the trauma and the silence that followed.
We spoke to Christena about the twists and turns of the investigation, the emotional toll on those involved, and the complexity of memory. Hi, Christena. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Zoe and Chandi.
How you doing today?
Other than allergies, I'm actually doing quite well.
Good. You wrote a really, really interesting and amazing book, Bound in Silence. I really loved it. Can you just tell us a little bit about you, your background?
Okay, so I guess the short synopsis version would be I went to grad school to get my first master's, and it was actually in museum science and wildlife biology. The mentor that I had, the advisor that I had for the nonprofit museum side, he actually guided me really well and mentored me really well in how to start nonprofits, how to lead them, how to guide them. And I went off and I did that for a bit. And then I decided I wanted to go get my PhD. My PhD was supposed to be in environmental toxicology. After 4 years of being with a bad advisor, I was like, no, I'm just walking away with a second master's. And I did. I became a photographer during that time period. And I also had discovered the story that this book is about. And I started researching it, writing it. Life took over, graduated that second time with that second master's. And life took over again. And then I became a wildlife biologist for a nonprofit foundation. I did that for 8 years, and it was a fabulous job because I got to biologically monitor a piece of land here in Texas for continually 8 years. Like every month, I got to go and monitor what was going on. Then it was kind of like I still worked on the book, but then I had to really push myself. I pushed it, and Lauren Steffi, who is my publisher with Stony Creek Publishing, took a chance on this book and published it. So that's where we are at today.
What can you tell us about the murder case at the heart of Bound in Silence?
A really good question. But the heart of the story is basically how you had a 5-year-old girl that actually saw the murderer of her parents. And that little 5-year-old girl was ignored. Then she was bound to silence basically for 70 years because she was still afraid to even say anything, talk about it. And once she did, she told that story to me.
Littlefield, Texas is a fairly quiet place. Besides being the hometown of Waylon Jennings and the county seat of Lamb County, it doesn't really attract all that much attention these days. But back in 1943, it was the site of a gruesome and grisly double homicide. Dr. Roy Hunt and his wife Mae were both found dead in their home, in bed, bound together with rope and metal wire coat hangers. Roy had been beaten and shot, while Mae had been bludgeoned to death. It's quite possible that Mae wasn't even the intended target and was intended to live. There was only one witness to these crimes, and it was their 5-year-old daughter, Joanne. Joanne Hunt was 5 at the time of the murders, and her sister Jane was only a baby. Whatever, or whoever Joanne saw that night, she kept to herself for 70 years, until she met Christena Stephens.
But it comes down to the investigation itself was very, very haphazard. They were trying to pin these murders on somebody so quickly that they overlooked so much else that was going on.
You were born and raised in Texas. Just curious, how and when did you hear about this murder in this really small Texas town? And it's a historical murder.
Yes. How I came across this, there was always family rumor on my side, on my paternal side, of how this car wreck happened in the 1930s, and that this car wreck, it literally, drunk driver, and like all of the family was severely hurt and, thrown from the car. And what happened as a result of that wreck, my dad was only 3 weeks old, and he was in my grandmother's arms when the wreck happened, and they got thrown from the car with him still in her arms, and it caused him to become handicapped. And so what happened was I just kept hearing the rumors, and I thought I need to, as a researcher, I wanted to find out. I wanted to get to the heart of the story. And so I started going through old bound newspaper journals because at that time, newspapers were fully bound in these really, by year. And so I started trying to go through by years, especially when the wreck happened, and I didn't come across anything. And so I just continued going through these bound journals because it's it's really cool to go back and look at old newspaper ads. It's kind of cool to go back and look at what the newspaper headlines were at that time and all these other little tiny stories. And by the time I got to 1943, it was kind of as soon as I turned that one page, that headline blazed out in front of me. And then that one photo of the 2 daughters caught my attention, and it just became ingrained in my memory. And once it did, I was intrigued by the story. I couldn't let it go. Something just captured my attention, and I couldn't walk away from it.
What can you tell us about the case itself, and also what made you decide to look into the case further? And really, I guess when you started looking, what made you go deeper and deeper?
So how I became deeper and deeper into the story is this was another thing of serendipitous events that happened. So when I graduated the first time with my master's from Texas Tech, I became involved in trying to save a historical ranch here in Hockland County. And I was presenting at West Texas Historical Association, all of my research, me trying to present, this is a very important piece of Texas history that we need to save. Finally, I took the project as far as I could. And once I did, me presenting and writing, because I was never really supposed to be a writer, I got that little, it got into my blood, and I just wanted to continue to write. So I went back to all of the files that I had originally collected within that first 6 months after I discovered this story. And I decided I had enough to write a 10-page paper. So when I wrote that 10-page paper, one of the reporters for the Avalanche Journal, Lubbock Avalanche Journal, saw what I was going to be presenting on for a West Texas Association conference there in Lubbock. And he actually wrote a story on my presentation. And what happened was I walked into a room that was completely packed, and I was speaking with 2 other well-known historians, and nobody cared about those other 2 historians' papers. They were there to basically see and hear my presentation. In the audience was Sue Sexton, Roy Hunt's niece, and Roy Hunt's nephew. What transpired was the fact that I gave my paper, you could hear a pin drop. And I mean, when I'm talking the largest audience ever to a presentation, we're talking at least 120 plus. And afterwards, had the questions, had Sue hugging me, and I'm sitting there with my friend Cecily out in the foyer of the hotel where the conference was. And we're sitting there, and I always have a thing of where, asking people that are close to me or even not close to me, did I do okay with this presentation? What could I have done better? Trying to get the feedback so I could, in the future, avoid either doing that or continue doing what I was doing. And then all of a sudden, Gene Preuss walks up to me, and he was like, "Christena, great paper, great presentation, and you need to turn this into a book." And he said, "Oh, by the way, I have the original crime scene photos." That was just like an oh my God moment, because I was not expecting that. And once that occurred, it was kind of like I had to continue doing this story and turning it into a book, because more serendipitous events happened like that. Yeah, that's how this story really became a book in itself.
That's great. Yeah, serendipity. It's weird how it happens that way. And, the way you write about the case and how you structure it in the book, and we're not going to give too much out because people, you got to go and get the book. But it's really interesting because you lay out the key people, and there's so many different pieces to it. So what was your research process for Bound in Silence?
That was a long, complicated process. So I had to so when I started off, you have to understand, I was only looking at the local court cases and looking at the local newspapers for any information that I had. And then I had to start realizing, look outside the box. So I was going to other archives here in Texas. I was going to the Texas State Archive, because if somebody at that time, back in the 1940s, 1950s, if you got any type of conviction, especially if it was a murder conviction, it automatically went to an appeal. And so I had to get all of the appeal cases from the Texas State Archives for both the man that was accused of murdering the Hunts, and as well as all of the appeal cases for the doctor that was brought into the story a year earlier, who had supposedly shot Roy Hunt in a field and almost killed him.
On May 21st of 1942, Roy and Mae Hunt were entertaining friends when Roy received a series of phone calls. On the third one, he answered. The caller asked him to go out to Clovis Road, as there had been an accident. He identified the caller as Ruth Newton. He and Ruth had had a previous but brief relationship years before. Ruth was now married to Dr. Billy Newton. She had been a nurse, employed at the same hospital as Dr. Hunt, And Roy had previously worked with Dr. Billy Newton as well. When Dr. Roy Hunt did arrive on Clovis Road, there was no accident to be found. He exited his vehicle and walked up to a car that was allegedly occupied by Ruth Newton. They exchanged words briefly. Then, stepping out from behind the car, was Dr. Billy Newton. According to Roy Hunt, Dr. Newton shot him twice, once in the abdomen and once in the shoulder. Roy was able to get away and receive medical care at a nearby hospital. This case made it to trial. Dr. Roy Hunt testified at the trial, naming Billy Newton as the alleged attacker.
And then it was still combing a wider spread of newspapers like the Dallas Morning News, the Kansas City Star, even going to detective magazines, because at that time, detective magazines were a really big thing back then. And so you had guys writing about this. I did try to talk to as many people as I possibly could. And as a result, when Sue Saxton, who was Roy's niece, when she said, if you want to meet Joanne and Jane Hunt, who are the daughters, Roy and Mae Hunt, I can set that up. And what happened? It comes back to another serendipitous thing. If Sue had not been at my presentation, I probably never would have gotten the interview with Joanne Hunt. And so even after me talking to Joanne the first time and then the second time in her Oklahoma home, I continue to try to unearth as much as I possibly could. And I mean, places like Find a Grave, other genealogical sites, they were a wealth of information in trying to give me the actual names of the people, because even at that time, newspaper reporters were only used initials of people and their last name. And I didn't want to use just the initials of the people. I wanted to actually put a first name with that person, with this story. So yes, it was a long, complicated process, because I tried to, I wanted to make sure that all of my bases were covered, that I didn't leave a stone unturned. And, I could have continued researching this book and this story forever, because it always seemed like I was seeing something new, finding something new. But eventually the research had to stop and the story had to become the story.
So you mentioned that you interviewed Joanne Hunt. What was that experience like? And also, was there anybody else that you kind of had to track down to speak to for this? Or were there no other really first-hand sources?
So with first-hand sources, there were some people that I did talk to, but memories had escaped them. And so I knew I could not really rely on what they were telling me. Some of the another source was the actual district attorney. His son actually still had all of the original Hunt files, the Thomas files. So I was able to get a hold of those. But with Joanne, I had never done an oral history interview with someone like this before. And I was mentored by Bill Neal, who was a lawyer and a historian himself. And he told me, okay, Christena, this is a fantastic opportunity, and you need to let the discussion, this is how you need to do it. And so going back to the very first time that I saw that photo in that bound newspaper journal, it was always kind of like a dream in the back of my mind that I would give anything to be able to meet these two daughters. And I never thought that was going to be possible. I thought this story was going to go to the wayside, never meet them. And then it was kind of like, once I met them and once I got Joanne's first interview and heard what she told me about what happened in that house that night, and then months later when I went to visit her in her Oklahoma home, she didn't falter from her story. And in a way, every time I read and think about what she heard, just from her viewpoint, the story became scarier to me. And man, I'm honored that Joanne wanted to talk to me, that she told me her story, because she was basically bound in silence for 70 years. And that's a tough thing to live with. It really is.
And speaking of memory can be funky. I mean, it's failed us in the past. So how did what you discover and what you research relate to Joanne's memory of the case and what she told you?
So if you read the book and you read the murder scene and the bodies and how they were discovered and what was done to them, you immediately start understanding that this was more or less a crime of passion. This was personal. This was deeply personal. It was not, some random dude, climbing through the window. This was deeply personal. Blessed to have the first interview with Joanne. And then when I got the second opportunity to interview her again, it was kind of like I needed to make sure that her story did not falter from the second time to the first time. And it didn't. And then, yes, there were other secrets that she told me that during that second interview will always probably remain with me. But at the same time, when you hear her story and then you read it, and then you understand what happened in that bedroom when her parents were murdered, it really cements the fact that this was personal. This was not, like I said, this wasn't some random dude coming off the street. This was deeply personal.
How did your interview with Joanne, but also just what she told you, how did that affect you? Did it have a psychological effect on you? Did it have an emotional effect on you? And how did it influence your writing?
One of the toughest things as a writer is having someone trust you with their story that they've never told before. Even though I had all of the facts laid out in front of me on my computer in a Word document and on paper, it was trying to take her story to the point of it was in her voice, not me interpreting her voice, but it was in her voice. And that was extremely challenging. Her story, it had a long-term effect, because you're thinking, you want to make sure that you do something, you want to do right by her and her story, but at the same time, you don't want to screw anything up. And that was my biggest fear, was screwing something up regarding this. And then like I said, the second time I interviewed her, and when she didn't really falter, that made my mind start going in all directions of what somebody, had previously said to me a few years ago prior to that second interview, was that this was personal. The murders were personal. It was just deeply personal. Even today, I still think that in a way, when Joanne talked to me, I can still hear her voice in my head, because she had this really deep, groggly voice, like even deeper than mine when my allergies are bad like they are right now. I even gave her a ringtone of a toad, because that's what her voice sounded like to me. I know that sounds crazy, but it's kind of like, when she would call me, I wanted to make sure that I didn't miss her phone call in the amongst of, the chaos of life and everything else. If I heard that ringtone, I was like, oh my gosh, that's Joanne calling me. It's almost like her story, it's like a video playback in my head. And I know that may sound weird, but it's almost like a video playback in my head sometimes.
It's clear, that speaking to Joanne Hunt affected you. So this murder happened in Littlefield, Texas. And how did that murder affect that small town? And does it still affect the town today?
So initially, this was not the first murder that had occurred there in Littlefield at that time, back in the 1940s. A sheriff had been previously murdered in, I think, 1937. And Littlefield was rural. It was a quiet town. Everybody left their doors unlocked. Kids would roam the streets freely. And then all of a sudden, when the murders happened, of the Hunts, it was kind of like everybody started locking their doors. People wanted to move away from that neighborhood, move away from that section of Littlefield. All of the trials ensued, and that kind of kept everybody, I guess, on edge. to a certain extent, because they were really hoping that the man that was trying to be convicted of these murders, that eventually he would, stay in prison the rest of his life. And, probably with time, people started forgetting, especially after the gentleman that was accused of their murder. He was actually murdered himself in Oklahoma.
At the time of the Hunt murders, Jim Thomas was out on parole in Galveston. Because of his criminal past, he was brought in for questioning and ultimately wound up being charged with the murder.
So probably after his murder, everybody probably started just forgetting about what happened. But the way I look at it, it's kind of like a dark shadow kind of set on that town, and it never lifted ever again. And it's almost like, the house itself where they were murdered, that's like an arrested decay of where it's just kind of like it's got a hand sitting there protecting it to keep it from going away.
Seems like there's still a slight effect almost 80 years later.
What insights have you gained about small town dynamics and how they influence murder investigations and criminal cases? Because also, though, in Texas, it seems like, you have Texas Rangers and other people investigating this case, too.
I'm going to take you back. So I never looked at the investigation process. I mean, yes, I did look at the investigation process of like the Texas Rangers, the sheriff, and the other local deputies that were there. But I never really deeply paid attention to those techniques until one day I was giving a presentation at the Lubbock Women's Club for a yearly banquet for women. I presented basically kind of the same paper that I presented at West Texas Historical Association on these murders. After I finished presenting, and you have to understand there was a mix of ages of women in this audience. And I said, are there any questions? And there was a couple of ladies that, asked me questions. And then there was another one, and she had her back to me in the audience. She said, I have a question. Why can't you just go dig up those bodies and get some DNA off of them? And my friend Jenny was with me at that time. We both turned and looked at each other, and I said, wouldn't that be remarkable to be able to do that? But then that just be based on that one question of that little lady, it got me to thinking about, okay, so what forensics were used at that time? Back then, was there anything available that would have helped to better solve this crime? And so I started in the investigation process of going into the early forensics, reading books on what was available, how the research became more evolved, and especially in the 1920s, 30s to 40s. I even went to the Texas Rangers Museum there in Waco to try to see what was possibly available back then. And, you think about it, even in 1943, forensics was more advanced than a lot of us think it was. And so that took me in a whole new direction. And it also made me realize, and I keep wanting to say gumshoe, but I don't think gumshoe is the right word I want to use, where you had a lot of sloppy detective work in this story. Because even with the first shooting of Roy, well, what happened to those bullets? And even, why didn't they get any car tracks at that first shooting? Why didn't they get cast of that? Why didn't they, why do you have only one single drawing of the car track at the actual murder scene itself? What happened to that fatal bullet that apparently, that did kill Roy? There were so many missteps. And I think a lot of it was the fact that they were just trying to quickly, make sense of this heinous crime. And they were trying to find an answer, pin it on somebody as quickly as they could to make themselves feel better, thinking that they were actually doing something positive when in fact they really weren't doing anything positive. They were being more detrimental to this case and in finding the actual killer. It's themselves. But, even today, you still have people, especially in a small town, even in larger towns, It's easier to not follow the evidence and try to make sense of something, something that's heinous, because we don't want to follow the proper techniques. We don't want to follow a true, what it's going to take and involve an actual investigation, because we need this to be closed. We want, this closure, that this will give us an immediate answer. Forensics is still not a perfect science. Still, if you at least use the tools that are available, you might get a better answer and a better lead on where you need to look at the investigation and actually what occurred.
To touch on that, with the trials being based more on witness testimony than about the physical evidence. So what are some of the other physical evidence notes that you've kind of discovered when you were looking at the case, at the scene of the murder?
So it goes back to when Roy was first shot. Those bullets were not introduced into his trial. It was basically all his eyewitness testimony. You go back to the murder of the sheriff, and like I said, I think that was in 1937. My dates run into each other. But at that time, when Lloyd was shot, he had 2 bullets removed from him. And when the trial came, and it was a rather quick trial of Kelly, the doctor that originally removed those 2 bullets actually brought them in a vial to Kelly's trial and introduced them into evidence. So I'm thankful that I went further back in the story in my research to discover the murder of the sheriff, and that I'd gotten the appeal case and saw where Dr. Kruger had actually brought those 2 bullets in to be introduced into evidence. So you look at Roy's first case. So what happened to those 2 bullets that were removed from him? They were never introduced into evidence. And I always say this most damningly, what happened to that fatal bullet that killed Roy? Why wasn't that ever introduced in any of the trials against the man that was accused of murdering him? That should have been one of the key pieces that was introduced. And it's kind of like, no, we're not going to talk about that. And I think, I've got my theories on, or my main theory about what happened to that fatal bullet. But it's kind of like, that is just something, you think, okay, if you're going to do it in 1937, why don't you do it in 1942? And most importantly, why don't you do it in 1943 when it actually caused the death of a man?
I guess I wonder if you have Dr. Newton, who is a doctor, so it's kind of like a prominent person in society, as opposed to Jim Thomas, who is a career criminal. And it's easier to probably go in that direction and pin it on him based on his prior convictions and crimes, and not really pay attention to evidence that they should have been paying attention to. That's one thing that I kind of gathered is it's easier to pin something on somebody when they're kind of an easy target, which is unfortunate. And he kind of spent a lot of time in trials because of this case that he most likely had absolutely nothing to do with. And that kind of leads me to the next question that I have is, it seems like there were leads in this case that were not really followed. Why do you think that is?
Laziness. I say laziness right off the top of my head, but I think a lot of it was the fact that they already thought they had their man. So why are we not? There's no point in us going and, for instance, in checking the guns at Dr. Newton's house. There's no reason for us to go and talk to the other people that were around WR. Like, did he actually own a plane? Maybe, maybe not. But at the same time, why didn't you look into that further? My thing with the Newtons is the fact that the logical thing, because you still had ballistics testing, and even in the early 1940s, it should have been a logical thing. Oh, we need to go gather his guns and test them to see if they've been recently fired. But they didn't do that. That wasn't even a question in those investigators' minds, because they thought they already had their guy. And even with Newton, in the Newton trials, he had a whole slew of lawyers. And you think that those lawyers, his personal lawyers, would have introduced the guns. Even the prosecutor would have tried to introduce the guns. Yeah, this is probably, the pistol that, shot Roy. He was convicted based solely on Roy Hunt's testimony. To me, that was shoddy police investigation.
You had mentioned in the 1940s, forensics was a lot better than we think it was, but it has gotten a lot better now. In the 80s, for example, you think if we had the same type of caliber of forensics in the 40s that we did in the 80s, do you think the case would have been solved?
Yes. And I really probably think if they had just sat down with Joanne and actually talked to her, even if they had talked to her, even if it was a few months later, and not just, all of a sudden, we're going to present Joanne into the courtroom without talking to her, because, DAs, district attorneys, back then, they didn't even talk to their witnesses at all. In some cases. And it was kind of like, we're just going to put you on the stand and then I'm going to ask you questions. If they had actually sat down and talked to Joanne, if they had actually stood back and looked at that room and looked at what was presented to them with those bodies and tried to interpret what was going on. And then I hate to say this because this might be a big reveal, but at the same time, even if they had had a DNA kit or the rape kit, they might have actually been able to zero in on who did this.
So you mean even back in the 1940s, if they had done a rape kit, you think they would have been able to actually figure it out back then?
Well, at least if they had admitted that, if they had just not outright dismissed that there was no rape, because you have to understand, even in those early years, rape wasn't talked about. You didn't talk about it. And still you have a stigma today. In 2024, people don't talk about rape. Women don't want to talk about being raped because their whole lives are put on the front side, on trial for the entire world to see. That's unfair. That's unfair, because a woman should never be made to feel like it was her fault that she had done something wrong. And that's the reason why many things goes unreported, especially when it comes to rape. But even if they had thought about the possibility, then maybe this would have gone a different direction. But the way everything was done to their bodies and the display of everything else that was in the room, when you stop and go back, put it with Joanne's story, it's obvious what was going on in that room. It was obvious. And that's the scary part.
You mentioned before that it's not even that you felt that the murders were personal. You mentioned before that the murders were clearly personal. Why do you think the killer just kind of left the girls alone?
Because he knew them. If you have a cold-blooded killer coming into that house, a cold-blooded killer that, Jim Thomas was represented to be, he's not going to leave anything left to chance. It doesn't matter that there was a 3-year-old in that crib. It doesn't matter that there was a 5-year-old. You're going to wind up killing everybody in that house to leave no evidence behind whatsoever. In my author's thoughts in that chapter that my publisher wanted me to include in this book, that person that did this knew those girls. They knew Joanne. They knew Jane. They knew the layout of the house. A cold-blooded killer that is just randomly, coming in there, he's not going to know the layout of the house. He's not going to, Joanne and Jane would have died that night along with their parents. This was personal.
And the Hunts had a lot of guests come over, right? They would have social events and people would actually come over. So there were a lot of people who would have known the layout of the home, how to get in. And it's a pretty small home. It's not even that large. So it does make you wonder, could it have been someone other than the Newtons involved? But, it kind of goes back to, did they have any sort of issues with anybody else close to them that knew them so well?
So in all my research, I did not find anything regarding anybody having issues with them. And it wasn't until I was at Sue Sexton's house, who's the niece of Roy, her husband, Jim. I presented them with a copy of the book, and Jim comes out and he said, well, you know what the true story is about this? And I'm just like, what are you talking about? He said that there was another little girl. And I'm like, what? And Sue is just like, what are you talking about, Jim? And so the theory is, this new theory, and I don't even know if I should say anything about it, but the theory is that Roy was a playboy and that he had fathered another girl, and that the other husband found out about it, and that husband was getting revenge on Roy and Mae, and that Mae was really, she was supposed to be overpowered, but her death was unintentional.
That's why the rape.
Yeah.
That's personal. And like Zoe was saying, people liked the Hunts and they were well known. So people kind of coming in and out of the house. And also it's a small town. For it to not be, I would see more of it being personal than not. What would be the motive for like a home invasion in a small town?
When you think about, there was 2 doors to the bedroom, and after that first shooting, for those doors to always remain open, that tells you that the killer, the intruder, knew about that and knew that those doors needed to be closed. They knew that right off the bat. If this was Jim Thomas, and you have to understand, I stood there at the back of that house for a long time, and I kept looking at that window, that small window, because it wasn't like big windows like some of us have in our houses. He would have really had to have doubled over big time with his limp, everything else, to have climbed through that window. It would have been a struggle to have climbed through that window at his size. And when you think of how everything was like meticulously removed and placed and everything else, it was staged, but it was staged. It was staged in a way where there was no way it was Jim Thomas. I mean, it wasn't.
What do you hope readers take away from Bound in Silence?
I hope that they take away the fact that no matter the age of the witness, you always need to pay attention. It doesn't matter if it's a 5-year-old girl, a 10-year-old boy. You always need to pay attention to the youngest person, the person that, was affected the most by the crime. The other thing is the fact that never take for granted, unless you have clear-cut evidence and a clear smoking gun, that everything that is presented in a murder trial or whatever, you always need to question it unless you absolutely have pure, solid evidence. It's a process. So that's really, I guess, basically the 2 things, is making sure that, you always pay attention to your youngest witnesses and you actually sit down and talk to them. You get their story, whether it's right after, months after, you try to get their actual story. You don't ignore them. And the fact that don't take everything that is given to you or presented to you at face value. Always try to question it, because I know this is horrible for me to say this, but you can't always trust what the court systems are doing. You can't. It would be great if we lived in a society where we could absolutely have 100%, 110% faith in our justice system, but it has failed more than once, and just like it failed in the Hunt murders. And that's what I would say needs to be the 2 major takeaways from this.
What was the most surprising thing you learned about the case, the Hunts, Littlefield, everything?
It was the fact of how you had so many connections, and you think that those connections would have come and made a more solid case of trying to find the true killer, and it didn't. It was almost like those connections in the end didn't really mean anything. And what I mean by this is an example of one of those connections. Aubrey Bauver, who was one of the deputies that actually came and helped investigate the Hunt murders. His dad had been killed in the courthouse in Lynn County. And, the people that were coming along and giving them condolences, and how Aubrey had decided, he didn't want to do this anymore, be a deputy. It's that whole thread of the connections. And like I said, you think that the connections would have been pulled together in a tighter knot to have found actually who this was. And it's kind of like it didn't matter in the end. None of those connections meant anything in the end. It was just almost like that whole serendipitous fact of like how I came upon the crime scene photos or how the crime scene photos landed in my lap. There was that serendipity wasn't there back then when it could have been if they had just paid better attention.
How did working on the book affect you personally and individually?
How it affected me. So when you're trying to present a story historically, especially, even though this was back in the 1940s, 1950s, early 1950s, when you live with murders like this and for so long, and you're trying to take all of your research and formulate it into a story, it's almost like you don't want to watch anything that deals with murders. You don't want to read anything that deals with murders. You don't, especially, a lot of people ask me, well, you must be a true crime aficionado, or, you must really love it. And it's like, no, I don't want to watch any true crime stories. I didn't, because what I was researching and writing, that was too real, and I didn't want to be exposed to something else that was probably more heinous that even it occurred, even later in life. So mentally, it did wear me out, but at the same time, I got through it. And then at the same time, I'm thinking, well, nobody wants to read the story. And it was kind of like once I said, I can't sit on this anymore, and I put the story out there to 3 different publishers. Stony Creek Publishing came back. Actually, he just asked me one question. He said, do you think Jim Thomas murdered these 2 people? And I came back and I said, no. And he immediately wrote back and he said, I want to publish this book as long as you do, this and this. And I was like, hey, I'm agreeable to that.
Do you think the case will ever be solved in your lifetime?
I wish it would. Not that long ago, and this was before I sent the manuscript to Stony Creek, I had a very vivid dream of where somebody all of a sudden had just dropped this huge journal type thing in my lap. And it was going to reveal everything about, the hunts, the case, everything. I really wish that dream would come true. But, and if it does, that would be an incredible miracle. But at the same time, I think it's just always going to be unsolved. And that's really sad. It's sad for the Hunt family, and it's sad for the Franks family, because they are forever believing that Jim Thomas actually killed Mae and Roy, when in fact that wasn't the case. And knowing that people out there died thinking that Jim did this, yeah.
Say, you are in 1943 or 1944, the murder has happened, and if you could interview or talk to anybody, who would you want to talk to?
Okay, the first person I would want to talk to, unbelievably, would be Jim Thomas. I mean, I know that sounds crazy, but it would be Jim Thomas, because he was a character in himself. But everybody always said, "Oh, he was he killed this person, he killed that person, he did this, he did that." And it's kind of like there was never actually any proof of him killing anybody. Yeah, he shot somebody there in Lubbock County, but actually killing, there was never any direct evidence proof that he actually killed somebody. So Jim Thomas would be one of the first people I would want to interview. Like I said, it probably sounds really crazy, but it just sitting down with him one-on-one, that would be a miracle in itself if I could go back in time and do that. Because I think you could get a lot of insight from what he says and from what he could have said. And I'm talking, where it's one-on-one, where he knows that he's not going to get, it's not going to affect him one way or the other. And then the other would be talking to Joanne, even at that time. That would have been interesting to have been able to have talked to her when she was 6 years old, 5 years old, and just see, what she would have told back then, if that would have been possible. But yeah, Jim would be the first person I would want to actually sit down and talk to. Because everything that I ever read about him, researched on him, he was a gentleman through and through. And that in itself, that would create probably whole new take on this story.
So I have a question that kind of goes back a bit to the actual murder scene and kind of just the way that the Hunts were found. It's a very unusual way of finding bodies, right? Finding a murder scene. Like these people were bound together in a way. To that, what was the interpretation of that during the investigation? And I guess, what is your interpretation of that?
The investigators missed this on the initial. They didn't look at it as something being very personal, but you read the description of how the bodies were beaten, and then they were all tied and bound to each other. And, they were individually tied and they were tied together. And when you read that, you understand that was very personal. It wasn't something, a random purported killer like, Jim Thomas was supposed to be, or as he was labeled. You think he's not going to take that much time. He's just going to go in there, shoot, he's done, he's out. This was something personal. This was overpowering. This took time because this person wanted to inflict the pain. And it was more pain on Mae than it was Roy. Roy was like, he was initially bashed in the head. Then he was shot, then he was tied. And then it was kind of like everything that happened to Mae, that was personal. And then you tie everybody together. And so the reason why Mae was never she was intended victim, but she was never intended to die from her injuries. Because it's kind of like someone was supposed to go in there and find her and, take her to the hospital and unwrap her from, untie her from her husband. And then she finally died hours later. And then when you have the sheriff who immediately walks into the room and throws, disturbs the evidence and throws the blanket over the bodies, to, the story of, how Joanne was supposed to be in the children's closet and when in fact she was in the parents' closet. When I'm talking tiny room, 10 feet by 10 feet, that's not really a big room whatsoever. And, you had blood everywhere, it seemed, and probably the most gruesome scene any of those investigators had ever witnessed or ever seen before in their lives. And so immediately your brain back then is probably shutting down, not understanding what you're looking at. And because you have blood, you have, the bodies tied up to each other, and you have the display of the panties and the necktie and all of that. And a lot of what you're seeing is probably just, you can't process it because, we're not going to talk about rape. We're not going to think that, Mae was not the intended victim, that, it was always Roy because, apparently Roy had been shot, the year before. And that it was all about him when in fact it was really all about her. So I can imagine, especially, walking into that house, especially if you're the first person that discovers those bodies, oh my gosh, that lived with him forever. And this case had to have lived with all of those people that were involved. It had to have lived with him forever. You can't unsee that. Even though your brain probably can't process it, you still can't unsee it.
I really think the case, it cannot be anything but personal. I really think there's something with that whole Dr. Hunt having an affair and potentially that woman's husband inflicting the violence against Mae as revenge for Dr. Hunt.
That's not a bad theory. You're right.
Yeah, not everyone is just going to rape someone, right?
That's true. I guess it's also just, rape can happen even outside of, let's say, Roy Hunt having an extramarital affair. But it just seems like, okay, if, the year before he's shot and then this happens, there's something going on. There's something that involves him in some way, shape, or form for somebody to, clearly, for the Newtons to get him out in the middle of nowhere and shoot him. And for this to occur, something is going on.
And something was going on. And I mean, this is not to discredit what Roy Hunt said, especially under oath when he was testifying. But at the same time, it does make me ponder and wonder if it was not some other stranger or somebody that he knew that he was not going to implicate that was from that area that tried to kill him that first time out because, oh, you're having an affair with my wife or whatever. And, you know, the easiest thing for Roy to have done was, you know, blame it on the Newtons.
Right.
There's all types of speculation, but at the same time, when you don't have actual physical evidence, your mind is left to wonder. And it's left to wonder, like, well, why weren't those 2 bullets introduced into evidence in Newton's trial? Why did they just use Roy's testimony to convict him? And they even used Roy's dead testimony after he was dead to further convict Dr. Newton with no other evidence presented. To me, that was a clown circus show of them trying to justify that we still need to prosecute somebody for the previous shooting. For Roy, it's amazing because, you know, when you stop and think about it, well, especially after you hear Joanne's story, you're like, well, is there a possibility that this was somebody that really personally knew him that did the shooting and he just wanted to place it on the Newtons because maybe for some stupid reason he didn't like the Newtons? Don't know.
Yeah, it just seems like basically like Billy Newton would have to be like unhinged and crazy to just go after Roy Hunt and Mae Hunt. He would, like, there's somebody who has like a personal issue, and even though the Newtons were a little interesting, I don't know what the motive would have really been.
He did seem unhinged.
I don't know if there's enough for him to really say, like, I absolutely can't stand Roy Hunt and I'm gonna go after him. I don't know. We may never know.
But hopefully, you know, your book at least like gets the case out there to people. And it seems like most of the people involved are gone or passed away. So it may not be much of an incentive for the town or for the state to investigate. Like you said, bound in silence, but you got Joanne's voice out there.
Yes. And I mean, telling her side of the story, that was extremely challenging, but her voice needed to be heard. Her story, her side of the story, what she saw that night, what she witnessed that night, that was the important part of this. And it changed the whole scope of how I looked at this case, how I looked at this research, how I looked at this story. And I'm thankful to the little old lady at that presentation I did that talked, you know, that asked that question, well, can't you just go back and dig up the bodies and get some DNA off of them? Yeah, I would love to dig up Roy's grave just to see if my theory is right. I mean, I would, but it's kind of like it goes back to that whole serendipitous thing. If the events hadn't happened the way they had, this story wouldn't be in a book at the moment. And I'm extremely thankful for Lauren Steffi and Stony Creek Publishing for giving this book a chance and for actually putting it out there.
What's next for you, Christena?
I'm not really sure. I don't want to be a one book author girl. I would really like to probably do my story on beavers in Texas, the historical story, working on a children's book for a tripod coyote and porcupine book. There's a couple of other stories that may come along. I don't know. I just know that I really don't want to be just a one book wonder girl. I need more books out there. The first important thing is trying to get the beaver book done because that is a very important and unique story of how beavers likely got back to Texas back in the 1940s. Went back to the 1940s. How scary is that? I don't say in the 1940s, but apparently that's where, you know, I'm supposed to be.
You're not meant for 2024, are you?
I guess not.
That actually sounds like a really interesting book, actually.
You know, like nowadays, when you're an 8-year-old, all of the things that you're going to ask for your birthday. And, you know, an 8-year-old girl by the name of Betty, back in the 1940s, asked for a pair of beavers for her birthday. Grandfather went all the way to Colorado, trapped 2 beavers, and brought them back to Texas. And so that is just a unique story in itself. It really is.
That's cool, though.
Yeah, but that's exciting. Seems like you've got the writing bug, so that's exciting to see. Thank you so much for talking to us, for getting the book out there, getting Joanne's story out there. Yeah, it's never too late. I'm glad you were able to talk to her before she passed away.
Me too. So thank you, Zoe. Thank you, Shandi. I kind of remember how you found and discovered this book, and I thank you for that, discovering it and this opportunity to do this podcast with both of you. You are both awesome. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We'd like to thank Christena for her meticulous research, but mostly for her dedication to giving a voice to Joanne's experience, which was bound in silence for so many decades.
You can find Christena's book, Bound in Silence, An Unsolved Murder in a Small Texas Town, on Amazon or at your local bookstore. Make sure you pick it up to learn about the Hunt murders and Christena's conversations with Joanne. We'll have links to Christena's book and more resources in the episode's show notes.
Well, that's going to do it for this episode of Bound by the Cloak. You can follow us on social media. We're on X, we're on Instagram, we are on TikTok, we're on Threads. Be sure to like, follow, subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Whether that's on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or even Good Pods. And if you like what you hear, let others know. We'll be back again in 2 weeks with a brand new episode. Thanks for listening.
Until next time.